now streaming on YouTube.
Okay, live on YouTube. Says live stream is offline.
It says here it's live on YouTube.
Ah, there it is. Great. I'm going to turn my video off. All right. All right, you are live.
Great. Do you want to make me host, or you want to?
Yes. Now, switch that back to you. And there you have it. You are in control.
Fabulous. Thank
Great.
you.
I'm going to mute my mic
Okay.
and put it onto the pages, and we'll see you on the other side.
Sounds good.
Great.
Hi, everyone who's joining me. We're just going to get started in a minute or two. If you haven't already downloaded the source sheet, you can find that online, but let me see if I can maybe even just give you a link. Esther, glad you liked the background. Appreciate that. Okay, let me look for the link for anyone who would like to follow along. Give me 1 minute and then we'll get started. Here we go. Okay, I'm just going to put in the chat function here a link to the source sheet in case you don't have it already and you want to download it or have it on your screen, even though I will also have it on my screen as we're looking through it today. It's 101. I think we should get started. Sound good? Okay. Hello, everyone. Chag Sameach. Happy Passover. I hope no matter what you did last night, half of all. Baruch Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher krishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Thank you, God, for commanding us to engage in the study of Torah. All right. Today, we are doing part one of a two-part series story because this story is very famous and I think is best when it's broken down into two sections. So today will be part one. And you'll notice next week we'll do a little bit of a review of part one, but we'll also dive into part two and see how it is similar and different from part one. Okay, background here. This is one of those Talmud stories that is taught to rabbinical school students. It is taught in Or Torah to be asking yourself, what are the Q&A button near the middle of your, get a taste of the story. I'll make it. And sages declare it susceptible. And why the Oven of Akhnai by Judah, said Samuel, it is because they served it was insusceptible to uncleanness, but they did not accept them from him. So some say 400 cubits. They said to him, there's no proof from a carob tree. So he went and said to them, if the law accords with my position, let the stream of water prove it. And the stream of water reversed flow. They said to him, there is no proof from a stream of water. So he went and he said to them, if the law accords with my toward falling. Rabbi Joshua rebuked with one another in matters of law. What business do you have of the honor owing to Rabbi Joshua, but on account of the honor owing to Rabbi Eliezer? Tilted. So he went and said to them, if the law accords with my position, let the heavens prove it. An echo came forth, or some say a bat kol, a heavenly voice, saying, what's position under all circumstances? Rabbi Joshua said, it is not in heaven. It is not in heaven, said Rabbi Jeremiah. The sense of Joshua's statement is this. For the Torah has already been given from Mount Sinai, so we do not pay attention to echoes. Since you have already written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority, you are to incline. Rabbi Nathan, or Natan, came upon Elijah and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that moment? He said to him, he laughed and said, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. And that's the story, part one, because it's going to continue, but you're going to have to come back next week to hear part two. Okay, so we're going to break this down because on first glance, it's somewhat confusing, as with most Talmud stories. Again, the context is, we can imagine this is the 2nd century CE. The temple has been destroyed, and the rabbis are trying to determine the laws of the land. Laws according to the Torah, laws according to the Mishnah. The Mishnah, of course, was the law code that took all the laws that are presented in the Torah and tried to be more specific in how you are to live by those laws. And of course, as I explained before, then the Talmud comes along and riffs and gives commentary on the Mishnah, on that law code, and then we get the Talmud. Okay, so it begins with a discussion about an oven. Now you can imagine that the ovens back then are not like the ovens we have today, of course. So the clay oven, right? And I'm going to share my screen again so that as we go through this, we can try and break this down. And if you have questions, use the Q&A or the chat function so that we can explain in more detail if needed. Okay, so we're going to go back to the beginning of the story. Here we have learned, okay, now the rabbis are talking about this clay oven. If you cut a clay oven into parts and put sand between the parts as if they were bricks, in other words, you are making an oven, a domed oven, out of not one huge piece of clay, but in like bricks, and you're putting them together and there's sand in between the parts of the bricks. Rabbi Eliezer, who's the main character of the story, declares that the oven broken down and therefore insusceptible to uncleanness. In other words, that oven works. It's not going to become unclean. Anything that you use there will be considered pure. Right? There's a lot about purity and impurity in our tradition. So that's really what's being talked about here. And the details of the oven are not really essential. What we're dealing with here and what the story is going to delve into is the relationship between Rabbi Eliezer and the rest of the sages. Okay? The sages, in other words, everyone else in the Sanhedrin, the group of rabbis who are determining all these laws, they all declare that this oven is susceptible. Okay, so we have a contrast between everyone and Rabbi Eliezer. And this is what is meant by the Oven of Akhnai. This is now the storyteller kind of coming out of the story to say, and this is why we are calling it the Oven of Akhnai. Why the Oven of Akhnai? Said Rabbi Judah, said Samuel, it's because it is surrounded with argumentation like a snake, and proved it was insusceptible to uncleanness. That the argument actually from Rabbi Eliezer, as we will find, says that it is not insusceptible to uncleanness, and therefore it's going to be like Rabbi Eliezer says, but that the argumentation that's occurring is like a snake wrapping itself around. Okay, that's all background to the story. Now we're getting into the story itself. Now the oven really is irrelevant. It could be a conversation, an argument about anything, but in this case, they're focusing on the oven. Okay, so on the day that Rabbi Eliezer produced all the arguments in the world, and I want to reiterate this, he is not just coming and providing one argument for his stance as to why this oven is the way it is. Right? This is someone coming with every single possible argument that exists in the world. And remember, we talked last week about Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Hillel versus Rabbi Shammai and the differences in terms of how they argued, right? And this is a little different, but this is the idea here that he is bringing every possible understanding and argument in the world. But regardless of that, they did not accept them from him. The sages did not accept any of his arguments. So he said to them, if the law accords with my position, this carob tree is going to prove it. Since you don't agree, you don't buy any of my arguments that I'm making with my words, with my mouth, you know what's going to prove it to you? This carob tree. And so all of a sudden, this tree uproots itself from the ground and moves 100 cubits, and as some say, 400 cubits. Okay, an entire tree just magically uproots itself from the ground and moves. But they said to him, there's no proof from a carob tree. So already we have this really interesting thing that these sages who are watching this are seeing that this man first brought valid arguments with his mouth. And now he's saying, you know what, I'm going to prove it to you through this magical movement of this tree. And yet, even that, they say, there's no proof from a tree. They are not buying this as a valid argument. So he went on and he said, well, if the law accords with my position, let the stream of water prove it. And the stream of water reversed flow. Okay, so now, and then they said, there is no proof from a stream of water. So first we had one object go against nature. And now we have an even more powerful force going against its natural tendency. right? It's one thing for a tree to move. It still would be pretty ridiculous and crazy, but now for an entire stream of water to reverse its course. I mean, now we're getting even a more powerful, magical system being put in place to support Rabbi Eliezer's argument. And yet still, these sages are not buying it. So he went and said to them, if the law accords with my position, let the walls of the schoolhouse prove it. Now, this is interesting. He went from these natural places, right? The tree and the stream of water. Now, all of a sudden, it's moving into the place where all of these men are sitting, right? The walls of the schoolhouse, of the yeshiva, are the walls that are surrounding them as they're having this argument. And the walls of the schoolhouse tilted toward falling. Now, I think this is a really important point. Rabbi Eliezer has gotten, in my interpretation, so upset or so in such a position that he wants to prove his position that he is willing, potentially, to have the schoolhouse walls collapse. Now, what would that mean? The schoolhouse walls collapsing when people are inside it is really a destructive sign, right? We went from just natural changes around us with the tree and the water to now being so firm in your argument and being so faithful to that and knowing that you're right, literally knowing, having given every argument in the world and having these mystical things, magical things already happen to you. But now the walls of the schoolhouse are going to prove it. And they started to tilt towards falling. But Rabbi Joshua rebuked them, meaning the walls. Now, the Rabbi Joshua is talking to the walls, and he says, if disciples of sages are contending with one another in matters of law, what business do you have? He's now talking to the walls. This is why the story is so interesting. He's talking to the walls as if they are beings, sentient beings. And he's saying, walls, what are you doing getting involved in this argument? This is an argument between people here, like between the sages. Don't get involved. And as a result, they did not fall on account of the honoring of Rabbi Joshua, because he was a very famous rabbi and very learned. And he had rebuked the walls saying, don't fall down on us. You have no business being a part of this. But they also didn't straighten up on the honor owed to Rabbi Eliezer. And to this day, they're still tilted because Rabbi Eliezer, if we remember, is actually correct in his argument, right? All these things are happening because he is correct and everyone else is wrong, right? He is saying 1 + 1 = 2. They are all saying 1 + 1 = 3. And we all know that 1 + 1 = 2. And yet they weren't buying that. And all these things are happening. So now that the walls are tilted in. So he went and he said to them, Rabbi Eliezer said to all of them, if the law accords with my position, let the heavens prove it. All right, now he's going to the ultimate God up above. The heavens are going to prove his point. If they aren't going to buy anything that's happened up till now, which is pretty insane, then now he's going to bring God Almighty into the picture. There is nothing greater to support one's argument than God's self. An echo, that's this interpretation. In Hebrew, it's bat kol, right? A heavenly voice. And we've actually had references to heavenly voices in other stories. This comes up a lot. A heavenly voice, an echo, came forth saying, what business have you with Rabbi Eliezer? For the law accords with his position under all circumstances. A heavenly voice is calling down to all the sages. They are all listening to God's voice say, Rabbi Eliezer is correct in every single circumstance. And Rabbi Joshua stood up on his feet, chutzpah. It is not in heaven. He quotes Deuteronomy. He quotes Deuteronomy, which is a quote that says that the Torah is not in heaven. That is his retort to this voice of God. What is the sense? The rabbis asked. We're now kind of out of the story for a minute to really try and understand, well, what do they mean by it is not in heaven? Why would Rabbi Joshua be quoting Deuteronomy 30 verse 12 here as his retort to God? What is the sense? And said Rabbi Jeremiah, The sense of his statement is that for the Torah has already been given at Mount Sinai. So we don't pay attention to echoes or heavenly voices, since you have already written in the Torah at Mount Sinai, after the majority you are to incline. In other words, Rabbi Joshua's argument when they hear this heavenly voice is to say, God, you already gave us the Torah. And in the Torah, you said the majority rules. So we're not going to pay attention to anything that's going to be coming from heaven to contradict the fact that you already gave us the Torah. And we have been told at Mount Sinai that the majority is to rule. And we are the majority. Even if we believe that 1 + 1 = 3, that's the way it goes. Okay, it's not done yet. Really interesting about this idea of what is the role of an argument and how firm do you stay in your position, even if you're the minority, even if you know that you are correct. According to this, the majority rules. That's one teaching, but it doesn't end there. This is, I think, really the important thing. Rabbi Nathan came upon Elijah and said to him, now we're going back to the story. It's as if now there's a child sitting on his grandfather's lap and saying, but then what happened next in the story of Rabbi Eliezer and this oven? What happened? Tell me. So Rabbi Nathan goes to Elijah and says, well, what did the Holy One do at that moment? Is when Rabbi Joshua came back after this heavenly voice said, Rabbi Eliezer is correct in every respect. How did God respond to something like that? Now, I want you to think, how would God initially respond? You've already read the story, but initially, my assumption would be something like God coming back and saying, but at the end of the day, what I say goes. But in fact, that's not what the Talmud is teaching us about God's response. God's response here is God laughed and said, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Wow. This is only part 1 of the story, by the way. But I think that's the climax of part 1, the very last statement. God saying, when this rabbi has chutzpah enough to respond to a voice from heaven that says, that guy is right and you are wrong. When the rabbi says, actually, God, you already told us that majority rules, so we're not going to listen to your voice right now. It doesn't actually matter. And then God's response is, way to go. Way to go. You have defeated me. You have done well, my children. So I want you to think, what does that mean? What is this Talmud trying to teach us about the role of argumentation, the idea of how firm you have to be in your own position versus the idea that even when you are in a minority position, that there is a power of majority that at some point you need to just let go, even if you feel so strongly that you are correct. In this case, you will see. So I don't want to come to a conclusion per se about what this ultimately the story is trying to teach us, because it's going to continue next week. And you'll see what happens with these characters, because Rabbi Eliezer is not done. This is not the end of the story. But this is one point where we are seeing that God wants us to take control of how we interpret Torah. It is not something that was done a long time ago at Mount Sinai and completed, and therefore we have no ability to have our own interpretations and have those interpretations become valid, right? I think this is a really strong argument for liberal Judaism and a liberal understanding of how we create our own commentary on the tradition. Because just because it was the way it was back then doesn't mean that now we can't claim authority over it. I think that's one of the teachings that comes out of this, because the Rabbi Eliezer can kind of represent tradition, the power of a tradition, and we have to maintain that tradition. I'm not saying we just kind of throw it all to the wind, but at the same time, we have the authority to also come up with our own valid interpretations, even if it's slightly different from what existed a long time ago. So that's one take I have is this idea of a liberal understanding of commentary. And the other, I think, here is, where does authority come from? How do we understand what authority is in our own lives, in our society, and the challenges that come with that? So those are a few things. And by the way, this phrase, "it is not in heaven," is one of the most well-known phrases. Lo bashamayim hi. Lo, it is not bashamayim hi. It is not in heaven. From Deuteronomy. This idea that the Torah is alive in our lives today, in our current circumstances, and we have a responsibility, not just the opportunity, but I'd say the responsibility to figure out how we can interpret Torah for our days. So that means, for me, how do we take our teachings, our understanding of God, and how do we put them in the context of our current lives living in a COVID-19 world, right? And how does that change or reinforce our perspectives about what tradition holds? And especially since there were Jews all over the world last night during Passover, people didn't just give up on Passover because we couldn't be together, right? For me, that is the strength of tradition, that we find innovation and we find ways of maintaining tradition in new ways. Right? There are people in my neighborhood. I took our new dog for a walk last night, and it was empty. I mean, it was eerie at night because I live in a neighborhood that has many traditional Orthodox Jews, and so they were all hunkered down. There were a couple of homes that I walked by later in the evening, and they were still having their Seder and singing songs, and it was beautiful to hear. But it also reminded me of Israel on Yom Kippur, right? This time where everything shuts down. And to me, it was this idea that even in the crazy circumstances in which we're living right now, people were figuring out ways to innovate their own Seders, right? The virtual Seders, figuring out ways of maintaining tradition. And so that is God looking down, smiling, and said, my children have defeated me in a great way. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing that we continue to find new ways of connecting to our tradition as our world changes, as our lives change. Even in our own lives, we have to see innovation not just as an institutional challenge, but as a personal challenge to each of us. We are all changing, and we are definitely all changed by what's happening in the world around us right now. So how is our tradition and our connection to Judaism going to change as well? If you were to say it's not going to change at all, well, then I think that would be a naive approach, right? So, but are you taking the time to think about and to give yourself credit for however you are celebrating Passover, that you have found a way to do it? That, I think, is a beautiful thing, as opposed to seeing it as mourning the loss of us not being able to have Passover the way we always have had it. Yes, of course, we have to recognize that there is a time to mourn that, but there's also such hope and optimism that comes from the fact that we continue to move forward and we continue to maintain our connection to Judaism. So those are a few things from part one of the Oven of Akhnai. Next week, we are going to look at part two, and you will see that the story takes a really interesting turn and moves away from a conversation about God and our relationship to authority, really more into the realm of relationships and the impact of argumentation and debate on relationships. So that's the little preview of what we're going to get next week. At this point, are there any questions or comments? Feel free to raise your hand or do whatever you want to do. If you have any questions or comments, if there's anything that you want to add to the interpretation that I brought today, I'd love to hear from anyone who'd like to. Let's see. Have a question here. Esther wrote. Esther, you want to ask this line? Esther, do you hear me? Can you talk?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah. So why don't you ask your question as opposed to me reading it?
Okay. So my question while you were talking about it is, is there significance to the word defeated? Because for me, it opens up, the possibility that being defeated is not necessarily a bad thing. And it kind of makes me think about ways, as a parent, sometimes I'm impressed when my children ask me questions that either surprise me or show me new insight, and then you sort of have this sense of pride at the same time. So anyway, it's not really a question, but kind of just a comment.
Great comment. It makes me think about, especially as you say, as a parent, Avinu Malkeinu, right? During the high holidays where we call God our father, our king, a parental figure. And I very much think this is a moment where we have this connection to God as a parent, right? And a parent here that is not firm in the sense that everything needs to go the parent's way, but that we learn so much from our children, right? It's both a cliche thing to say, but it's also extremely true. What we learn about ourselves, what we learn about our world, what we learn about what it means to grow up from our children. And so, yes, I agree with you. I think this idea of being defeated by your children is not necessarily a negative statement. It's a sense of growth and maturity, right? This is God saying, you guys are growing up. You are seeing that what I gave you was a set of laws, just like we do with our children. And yet you learn that there's a complexity to those laws as you get older. And you learn that you have to interpret those laws in your own way. As you grow as a person, you start to see the world in your view. And you are going to shape your rules and the rules even that I gave you based on how you see the world. And I enjoy that. Right? We need to embrace, those of us who are parents, that maybe our children, when they don't necessarily do things the way we would have liked them to do, or maybe the way different than what we trained them to do or taught them to do, that there could be a way in which we can see that as a sense of pride, and that maybe it's not really about us, right? Maybe it's not a statement of our children breaking our rules or trying to disappoint us, but in fact, it's them finding their place and their voice in the world, right? So it's a really interesting way of seeing it. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much for bringing that up, Esther. Any other comments or questions about anything from this text that anyone would like to share or add? No? Okay. Well, feel free. You can always, oh, yes. Susan. Can you hear me? Go ahead, Susan. I unmuted you.
You can hear me?
Yep.
Playing the devil's advocate.
Love it.
One, in the world of science, we know most of the breakthrough discoveries were a pastor and others in Einstein were by soul voices arguing against the majority. Now that's science, but now we're talking about the realm of Judaism, but it isn't morality, really, it's the laws of Judaism. So how would you defend Rabbi Eliezer? Other than the fact, I understand, I mean, you did a fantastic job with this, that Eliezer was just a no compromise kind of guy and not hearing the other side and insisting on his way. So that I got, but just to play the devil's advocate, what about those who do know the truth and are put down by the majority? And in the realm of morality, what about slavery? Those who came out against it, the majority was, at least in the South, was for it. So there you go.
Great question. And I would reiterate that Rabbi Eliezer was correct. It wasn't just that he was firm in his position. He was correct.
Right.
And I think, it is an argument that went from being about an oven to that I think over time was elevated to a moral conversation, because he took it, and I think it turns from a conversation of scientific authority, so to speak, when we talk about the rules of Torah, from the tree and the stream, to me represent the conversation being held still within the framework, even still somewhat magically, in the framework of a scientific halakha argument. But as soon as it becomes where he has the walls of the sanctuary, of the yeshiva to fall down, that's where it starts to turn, where I think he is trying to make a moral argument, and he is willing to take down the whole system to maintain his position because he is correct. right? We have to remember, he literally is correct. They are wrong, but he is correct, and he knows it, and he has everything in his power and in the power of the universe to go with him. I think where you're getting at, where it comes to what do we do when we believe that we are morally correct and the majority are against us? I think that may come out in part 2 next week, as we turn to the relationships of the impact and the implications of this relationship between Rabbi Eliezer and the rest of the sages. Because you have to imagine now that they have come out and said, even God's voice doesn't support, we don't care even about God's voice. Now I want you to try and think, well, how would Rabbi Eliezer respond? He's got nothing left in his argument. He is defeated, right? Interestingly, God is saying, my children have defeated me. And yet there is one of his children who is completely defeated, and who you could see God turned God's back on Rabbi Eliezer, right? For all this time, he had gotten Rabbi Eliezer's back, and all of a sudden, now he's proud of his children for overturning his decision, God's decision. And yet, what about poor Eliezer? What about those people who do have a moral standard and who are not listened to by the greatest of authorities in the city, in the country, in the world, whatever it may be, whether it's racism and segregation and slavery, so many different things, right? So I think that we get a little bit more of that next week. So I don't want to totally answer yet, because I think it will be easier to kind of have that conversation when we see the whole picture, and maybe there'll be some insight there. So I would love for you to bring that question up and hold me accountable next week if we don't get some more insight on that. Sound good?
Sounds great.
All right, thank you. Michael Gorin. Hi, Michael. Go ahead.
So I'm going to, since this is about arguing, I would tell you that I would completely disagree with your interpretation, in the sense that I don't think that first of all, God laughing is not necessarily a positive. I mean, that's a bit of resignation. I mean, to me, demonstrating from nature things that everybody could see and yet denied it when it was clearly linked to being the justification for his position that you could discuss. What this basically shows is that mankind will hold to his views despite what he sees in front of his eyes, despite what nature provides. I actually thought it's very relevant today, where people were in complete denial about, for example, the pandemic developing, and seeing situation after situation arising that clearly showed that something was happening, and still in denial, holding on to their beliefs of what they did in the past is okay. I don't think that God is saying that this is such a great thing. I think it's the recognition that because mankind has the ability to make decisions, we also have the ability to make bad decisions. And that we make bad decisions often in defiance of what our own eyes and what reality really is out there, because we want to hold on to our beliefs. And I think it's an indictment of those who hold on to those kinds of beliefs, and God sort of being resigned, saying, well, unfortunately, this is the downside of what happens when I gave man the ability to have independent thought and make decisions. But I don't take this in all the same way that you are, as a justification for denying reality and going with what you think is the majority. I think this is a good case where the majority has failed.
Yes. Okay. I agree with you. I don't know if I made a judgment call during my interpretation that I thought this was a good thing that happened. I do think the Talmud is trying to teach us, and this is why you're also getting at some of part 2, because of what we're going to talk about next week. But you're right. This is not that the majority is correct when every single argument is against them. When 1 + 1 = 3 is truly wrong, we are not supposed to necessarily sit back and accept that as a wonderful thing. It's not that they are good characters here, or that they're doing the right thing. They are missing they are blinded to the reality. And just like you said, there were so many people who have been blinded to what's going on in the world today. However, I think that the Torah is teaching us that there is a power that comes with being in the majority, right? We could have instituted stay-at-home orders earlier on. We could have maybe done that on a national scale, but we didn't. And there are certain levels of authority that come into play and who have either the power or the majority voice to put things into place that are not necessarily good for us overall. And that, and the part about God at the end, I think, is more him saying, my children have defeated me, is that this goes back to the fundamental concept of free will that we get from Adam and Eve in the beginning of the Torah, that we have the power at the end of the day, and we're going to make some bad decisions, and the majority is going to make mistakes, as they have done throughout history. However, God is saying, I am leaving it in your hands, and you have taken control of decision making. And it's almost, you can read it either God is relieved that God doesn't have that pressure. You could see it as God as a parent who sees that his children are growing up and is learning the important lessons of what it means to live in the world, which is you are going to make mistakes or you're going to get it right. But so, yes, I think that's a great interpretation. And I think the negativity that you're referring to that comes with the majorities making a decision that isn't right comes into play in part 2. So I know there's certain things hanging. I just didn't want to give the entire story in one session because I think it would have gone on too long. So that's why we're breaking it down. And I think now we can all walk in, and I hope you all come back next week to part 2, where you will see what's going to happen. And we'll see that this is not all positive, that God saying this and the implications of the decisions by the majority are not all positive. So anything else you want to share on that, Michael? I don't know if that helps clarify.
Well, I think there is one valuable lesson in this, and that is God, because he laughed, is saying at some point you got to move on, that you can't hold on to your position fighting against the majority forever because nothing else gets accomplished. You get further marginalized. Mm-hmm. You have to accept that there's a limit. And I think that that's probably the valuable lesson. I think it's more resignation by God rather than he's happy with it. But that's the way the world works.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's great. Anyone else? Thank you guys for those comments and your interpretations. I mean, that's the weird thing about studying Torah in this format and not being all together in the room is because your interpretations are just as valid, if not more valid than mine, right? We are all in this process of having to struggle and bring our own interpretations together. And that's what makes this so rich. And that's why I think texts like this are so fantastic, because you can look at this from so many different angles. I'm going to bring a story to you probably in a few weeks about ugliness and about visual perception of the other and the impact of that. So there's so many, and there are lots of ways in which you can interpret that story as well. So that's the beauty of this. This is why I love Talmud study, is because there are so many different angles that you can look at one story from. So thank you for those comments and your interpretations. I think Susan has one more thing to say. Go for it, Susan.
It's just to thank you, and thank you for causing us to think and to grapple with these issues. It's wonderful. I want you to keep on doing this, even after we're through with this darkness.
Yes. Thank you. Appreciate that. All right, everyone. Chag Sameach. Have a wonderful Passover, and we'll be back together next Thursday, 1 p.m. For part 2, and I'll make sure to put the resource page for part 2 up. I'll try to maybe do it a couple days ahead of time, so if you want to take a look at it beforehand, but it will be announced next week, so you can go on to our resource page. If you go to wbtla.org/WBT at home, you'll notice on the left side, we've been continuing to work on the page thanks to Don Levy and our whole communications team. There's now study at home, prayer at home, all Passover at home, all of these different sidebar resources. And under study at home, there's a resources tab. And if you click on the resources tab, you can find not just resources from all of these Talmud studies, but also from some of the Torah studies that have been going on. lots of things. So that's where it will be posted next week. Also, there's a Torah study this Friday with Rabbi Stanley Davids. He's going to be talking about the Song of Songs. He's a congregant, but also an incredible author and scholar. So you can tune in at 12 o'clock for that this Friday. All right. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I will talk to you next week. Bye.